Hello, and welcome to the 9th episode of Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. In this episode, we will discuss the fortune roll. So the fortune roll is a tool the GM can use to disclaim decision making. There are some cases when running a game where the GM making a arbitrary, direct decision about what happens can feel uncomfortable for the GM themselves, because it's putting themselves too much into the fiction, into deciding what happens next, when it might be more comfortable or easier to disclaim that responsibility and pass it off on fortune or fate. Basically, to use a randomization element in order to decide what happens next, rather than make it a matter of personal decision. And this is a thing that happens sometimes in real life. For example, flipping a coin to decide who goes first in a game, or what you're going to eat for dinner for the night, or in more sophisticated cases, you can look at things like sortition, where, for example, jury members are decided by lottery, or in ancient Athens, where members of the government would be decided to some extent by lottery. Putting these things in the hands of fate can have some useful social benefits in terms of how people in positions of authority interact with everyone else in the group. And so that's true in a role-playing game as much as it is in other settings in society. So whenever it feels uncomfortable to make an arbitrary decision, then the GM can reach for the fortune roll in order to help them continue the narrative smoothly. So this is like the Die of Fate in the Burning Wheel or World of Dungeons, but it is more complex. The reason for that is because it can take trait ratings as a modifier. So, just as a refresher, trait ratings are any kind of stat in the game. So it could be an action rating, it could be a faction tier, it could be the magnitude of some kind of supernatural event. There are a number of such ratings in the game, and the fortune roll can take any of these as a modifier. And we'll get into that as we continue. Also, the fortune roll, notably, does not follow all the procedures of the action roll. The fortune roll is a much simpler affair. So, what exactly is it? Let's take a look. You roll XD6, where X is a relevant trait, or 1. Relevant trait rating, I should say. Or 1. And you add a dice for each major advantage, and subtract a dice for each major disadvantage. The results, on a 6, you get a good result with standard full effect. 4 to 5, you get a mixed result, limited partial effect. And 1 to 3, you get a bad result with poor or little effect. And of course, if you crit, then you get an extreme effect, right? It's pretty straightforward. And one thing you might notice looking at this roll structure and thinking about, okay, it can take trait ratings as an input to the roll, XD6, where X is some trait. It's kind of similar to the basic do something risky move in World of Dungeons, right? It's kind of similar in a way to the standard roll structure in Apocalypse World games. And in fact, if you really wanted to, you could run Blades in the Dark entirely on the basis of using fortune rolls. You could skip the action roll entirely and just use the fortune roll to decide what happens in the game, right? Like the 6, 4, 5, 1 to 3 roll breakdown is pretty similar to what you use in PBTA games. and you could just run the game entirely on the basis of the fortune roll if you wanted to. If you find the action roll to be too constraining, then go ahead and do that. However, it's not really recommended because part of what Blades of the Dark brings to the table is that very elaborate, codified action roll structure. So it's a thought to bear in mind. This is a very flexible and very simple mechanism for deciding what happens. However, you're probably going to want to make use of the action roll. It's up to you. So what are the use cases, or some use cases for the fortune roll? Because as I said, you could kind of use it to decide anything in the game. Here's one. You need to make a determination about a situation the PCs aren't directly involved in. So what does that mean? Well, for example, a faction versus faction conflict. Two factions in the game world, in Duskfall, are fighting it out, and neither of them is a faction the PCs belong to. You want to see how the world moves, how the big players or little inconsequential small fry are fighting it out, and what happens. Because the PCs aren't involved, you're definitely not going to use an action roll. And so in this case, you're probably going to use a fortune roll to decide what happens. When an outcome is uncertain, but no other roll applies. So what does that mean? Well, for example, determining the effect of drinking a random potion. So in some games, this would be determined by a table, right? So you drink the mysterious potion, roll 1d20, and see what the effect is from this table on page 162, right? That's something you might see in a lot of older role-playing games. In this case, the fortune roll is not going to give you a specific effect, but it will tell you whether the effect is good, mixed, or bad. So, if it's a good effect, you drink the random potion off the shelf, and it's a potion of strength. You feel super strong, yay. Or you drink it, it's poison. You are puking your innards up. Oh no. Right? Like, these, at least the sort of outcome that you get can be partially determined by the fortune roll, and then the fiction has to be decided by the GM. Pretty much just like it would be in World of Dungeons, right? Alright, so let's continue here. More use cases. Determining some special outcome of an action roll. So this is not the action roll, but what the outcome of the action roll is. So, for example, does a sniper shot made with Hunt kill instantly on hit or not? So you might say, well, that should just be determined by the effect level, right? Well, yes, perhaps. However, maybe the GM feels like, okay, we've gone through the whole procedure of the action roll, we've determined position and effect, we've added in all the bonuses, we've considered the fictional positioning, and yet I still feel like I'm on the fence as to whether this sniper shot is going to be an instant kill or not. In that case, well, disclaim decision-making to the fortune roll, right? Make the roll, see what happens. Determining if the crew wanted level attracts some special action from a faction. So this is a downtime phase thing. Your crew has a wanted level. What you do can bring it up or down, but it's not as though there is a automatic necessary result to your wanted level hitting a certain rating, right? It's something the GM has to consider and make judgment calls on. And if the GM is not sure what to do, then again, a fortune roll can be useful. So do inspectors come after the PCs now or later, right? Is that going to be the next downtime phase, or is it going to be this downtime phase? That's something you can determine with a fortune roll. determining the disposition of the opposition independent of a PC action. So this is a really interesting case I hadn't thought of when I first considered what you could do with the action roll. Example, is a mark especially swayed by appeals to greed? So if you think about this, with the action roll, the PC is using their action rating, let's say in sway, to get what they want, to try to do what they want, to try to overcome the opposition. They determine an approach, and so on. And when the GM is setting position and effect, they do take the fictional positioning into account. However, it may be a situation where the established fictional positioning or what the GM has prepped before the session isn't really sufficient to determine what the effect might be. And so if you're thinking as the GM, okay, this character, what kind of person are they? Are they especially greedy or not? You can determine that with a fortune roll and then go on to set the effect, the position and effect based on that. So if they are especially swayed by appeals to greed, then the position or effect that the player character is in when they make their sway roll could be very good, and vice versa. It could be ineffective if they are not swayed by greed, right? If that's not something that drives them as an NPC. So again, the point here is that it is not the action roll, but it is interacting with the action roll to determine what happens in the fiction. All right, so let's talk about trait ratings in some more detail. So the fortune roll can use any trait rating. As I said, you could potentially determine anything in the game with a fortune roll. So for example, with factions, you could roll with tier. So in the faction versus faction example that I mentioned earlier, rolling with tier would probably be the way to do this. Gangs operating independently of a faction, you can roll with quality. Okay, so that is basically the tier of the gang plus any modifiers that are on that tier. So normally it's equal to tier, but you can have some modifiers that increase or decrease quality above or below what tier is. Supernatural powers, you can roll with magnitude. So that's pretty much just the trait rating you use for supernatural powers. PCs gathering information, roll with the action rating. Again, this is not an action roll, but you roll with the action rating. So if you have 3 points in Hunt, and you're using Hunt to gather information somehow, then yeah, that's the trait rating you're going to use. And importantly, this is not an action roll. So if no trait applies, roll 1 to 4 dice to represent sheer luck. So this is XD6, where X is anything between 1 to 4. When it involves opposed parties, roll a dice pool for each, and the highest one wins. So in a faction versus faction situation, they both get their XD6, where X is their tier, and each one of them rolls. Whoever gets the highest result is the winner. That's how you can do that. All right, so that's it for the fortune roll. In the next episode, we are going to talk about gathering information, and I will see you then.